Greetings. Ken Woodward here. Welcome back to another episode of Curated Questions. Together, we engage inquisitive humans about how they use questions to navigate and make sense of our world. I'm a fellow traveler and pilgrim on this journey, and I'm glad you're here. We live in a world that loves answers. We reach for them fast. We reward them. From the first day of school to the last day of work, we are judged by the answers we give. But nobody really teaches us how to ask. My guest today has spent her career on the other side of that ledger. Dr. Lani Watson is a philosopher. The world knows her as the questions doctor. She has thought hard about questions and has now written down her findings. Her new book is called Q, The Hidden Power of Questions in a World That Wants Answers. And it makes a quiet, radical case. Questions are power. That power is real. And it is everywhere, and it is not shared evenly. Lani has spent years asking what a question even is. Lani, welcome to Curated Questions.
It's fabulous to be here, Ken. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to be able to engage with someone who has engaged with questions so deeply. This will be a joy.
Great.
I always like to start the conversations at the same point, and that is to understand, when did you first understand the power of questions?
Yeah, it's a great question. And for me, that it comes back to, I think, a therapeutic context. I talk about this at the start of the book, when I was about 20, my early 20s, going through therapy. And the therapist was doing what a lot of therapists do. She was asking me questions during our sessions, and we were making progress and getting into lots of deep territory and exploring a past trauma that I was recovering from at that time. And I started to suddenly pay attention to the questions she was asking in a kind of new way. It started to really dawn on me that when I was in those sessions, there were some questions where she would ask and I really wouldn't even need to answer. All the work, all the revelation, all the development, all the progress was done just in her understanding me well enough and understanding my situation well enough to ask a question that would reveal something to me. And it didn't need an answer. And I became really fascinated in the idea that there are questions that don't need answers and that can still do all this powerful, deep, meaningful work in our lives. And I think I just became increasingly interested in how does that work and why haven't I noticed it before? And why did it take this therapeutic context to become so aware of this incredible power to change my life, to change the way I was feeling, to change the direction of things for me? And this is an experience that a lot of people will be able to relate to simply by asking questions. And then I thought, if that's true here, then it's probably true in lots of other places. And when I started looking, I realized it's basically true everywhere. It's true everywhere we ask questions. We have this kind of power, and it comes in different ways, and it gets manifested in different forms, in different contexts, with different relationships, or on our own, or wherever we are. But we all do it, we all have it. And then, as you said, we often don't pay attention. And that was what got really interesting to me, because why do we have this amazing power and not pay attention to it? And then I've been thinking about that ever since, really.
Oh, that is a great story in that, at some point, and this is what I appreciate about questions as we think about them, it's like, at some point, we almost do the out-of-body experience where it's like, this lived experience is going on. So as I'm imagining, as you were telling that story, I'm imagining you're sitting there with the therapist and you're talking through the answers. And then there's this little bit of stepping outside and you're looking on from the outside going, this is fascinating. How is this happening that there's all this work going on? What is the magic in that?
Yeah. The magic is the right word as well. I think of it as magical. An alternative subtitle at one point for the book was The Power and Magic of Questions. And ultimately, it's quite a long subtitle already. So I dropped the idea of magic, but I do talk a bit about magic in the book. And I do think of this as a kind of everyday magic. Yeah.
So then what did that journey look like for you to actually translate that from a curiosity into now a lifetime career and study, to go and to get a doctorate and have the topic be questions? That's quite a leap, going from noticing something to, this is something I actually want to dedicate my life to and really research.
Yeah, I think it wasn't like a sort of straightforward leap, as you can imagine. I was studying philosophy at the time as an undergraduate, that I was going through that therapy. And I left philosophy. I stopped studying. I went out into the world of work. I worked for a travel company for a while. I wanted to explore the world and thought that travel industry would be a good way to do it. Turns out it's more about booking other people's holidays than your own. And then at some point, I made a decision to, in that interim period, I had not stopped thinking about this topic and this power and trying to start really noticing it in my own life. And it was just the obvious thing for me to study, go back to philosophy and really think about. And I found a brilliant context to do that at the University of Edinburgh. And yeah, continue to be passionate about studying as well as communicating this fascinating topic.
That appreciation. So we had, just outside of this context and DMing and getting to this point, even anyway, one of the things that we had touched on was the fact that this is a relatively small community. And over the course of the lifetime of humanity, it seems like this might be something that's studied more. So as you started into this study, what was that like for you in finding not too much was out there, almost a wasteland, if you will, of kind of neglect? How did that work for you?
Yeah, it's kind of its own source of curiosity, isn't it? Because it is surprising. And yeah, like you say, there is a kind of small and growing community of people right now who are thinking about this and talking about this topic. And everybody has got that same experience of expecting really that, okay, I'm gonna try and understand more about questions in my own life or in the world. And the first thing I'm going to do is look for what other people have said about this right now, but also throughout history. And especially as a philosopher, of course, my expectation is that, okay, but we're definitely going to find some thinking and some really serious work on the topic of questions in the history of philosophy. And I still find it difficult to believe that it isn't there. I still find it difficult to say that because I'm convinced that someone's going to phone me up and say, you've missed a whole huge literature here. And undoubtedly, I've missed pockets of literature, but I am fairly confident that there just isn't a huge amount of thinking explicitly about the topic of questions in philosophy, in the history of philosophy, in the broader intellectual history that we have. And I haven't found it. And of course, I don't speak multiple languages, but I've certainly attempted to look at traditions outside of the Western canonical philosophy, and you still don't find it. You don't really find it in any really sustained or serious way. I personally am fascinated by that. And the more I continue to be confronted by that, the more fascinating it gets, because why? Why isn't that this study? I talk a lot about Socrates. Socrates is my main man, I think, in philosophy. And he's the guy, right? If you know anything about Socrates, you're often going to think of him as a champion of questions and questioning. And that's come through in right up to the present day. We have teaching and we have Socratic methods in legal education. We have Socratic forms of therapy. And yet Socrates even himself didn't interrogate this question as far as we know. Of course, he didn't himself write anything down, but we don't have any surviving record of Socrates asking, what is a question? What am I actually doing when I'm doing this questioning method that he became famous for? And that's a fascinating representation of this absence. Yeah.
Yeah, I had read about that not too long ago, just that observation that although Socrates did focus on questions, and it is such a part of what we remember him as, is that, yeah, there is this gap. He didn't get after that. So as you mentioned the gap, we don't really have any idea on his view or study or anything like that on questions. So he just used them as part of who he is, but he didn't really talk about the practice of.
Yes, he did advocate for the teaching of questioning, at least according to the dialogues we have from Plato. Socrates there's a few lines where he is very explicit about how important questioning is as a tool for learning and as a tool for interrogating ideas. So he did believe that we should, at least from what we know, that we should be learning and studying the art of good questioning, just as he was displaying. But he didn't go beyond that or behind that, as far as we know, to interrogate exactly what is a question and what is this questioning process itself.
So as you've studied him, are there things that the greater world, we, get wrong about his methods or his ideas, or whether it's wrong or underappreciated elements?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I'm not a Socratic scholar. So certainly if I were to enter into a debate with a Socratic, the real scholarly community that studies Socrates, they disagree on many different things about how to interpret what he's doing. And one big debate in that field is the question of whether Socrates was really sincerely trying to reach for truth or whether he was only ever trying to expose sort of inconsistencies and irrationality and falsehood. So was his questioning sincerely, truly about coming to know things and understand things about the world? Or was it more about trying to expose the people that he was interrogating with his questions? That's a debate. I don't necessarily have a good expertise to land on one side of it. My inclination is to think that at least some of the time he definitely was after truth, because it just seems like the kind of guy he was. But yeah, so I guess there's an element of that which maybe we don't always appreciate quite how antagonistic Socrates was and quite how intentional he was about riling people and frustrating the conversation and ultimately leading to a state called aporia, which I talk about in the book. That's usually translated as confusion or bafflement. That was Socrates' kind of end goal with his questions. Let's get to a point where we realize we don't know what we thought we did know. We're more confused, we're more baffled than we used to be. And then there are certain passages where he brings us out of that, and then we become more enlightened. But most of the dialogues just end with everyone being annoyed and frustrated and confused. And that might be something that we don't always appreciate about Socrates, because that's not necessarily the way you want it to end in a classroom or in a court of law, or arguably. But yeah.
So in hearing that definition, then let me go back. It was something that flickered through my mind when you were explaining that was, I'm like, I'm sure it was a mixture. Just because he's human and we've got all of a mixed bag of motivations and pretty much everything that we carry with us through the world. But yeah, that idea of using them strategically to bring frustration. I think through that, it's like, okay, if I know that I'm engaging in this, so on the receiving side, let's say, so if I'm on the receiving side of the Socratic method, I should expect we are going to get to the end of my knowledge and therefore not be frustrated by it. Know that this is what's happening.
Yeah.
Okay, we are going to find all the edges of my knowledge, my understanding of it, because I can't go forever and be able to fend off and say that I know everything. So I'm going to get to the edges of this and just recognize that and go, oh, okay, this is where the edge is. There's either work to do or some kind of resolution on that. But instead of trying to defend my ego and fight back and think that I'm going to get to the end of knowledge of all,
right,
which is where I would normally camp out at, but instead to go, okay, and just embrace that edge when we get there, because there's more to learn, and just embracing that moment, if you will, instead of fighting against it.
Exactly. And when you do reframe it like that and you do exactly what you're describing, then you start to see this aporia, this state of confusion and bafflement is actually a fantastically exciting, liberating, intellectually stimulating place to be, because you're really facing something that you don't know, that you thought you did often. Like, I find it to be a really exciting place to get to. It's something almost similar to awe in my mind. It's a kind of overwhelming sense of, wow, I really thought I understood things better than I did, and now I realize I don't. Isn't this an amazing, crazy, complicated world that we live in? And isn't there just so much to understand about it? And I guess if you're disposed to be curious at that point, then there's a lot to be taken out of a state like that. Of course, Socrates was picking his targets in a very specific way. He was looking for people who were particularly trying to claim knowledge, claim wisdom, claim understanding about important topics, about love, about friendship, about virtue, about politics, about society, about justice. And he was picking them out and targeting people that we would think of these days as pretty arrogant, people who definitely do not want to get put into that state, especially unwittingly. Someone in one of the dialogues describes Socrates as a stingray, that he comes along with his questions and numbs you into this state. And of course, that's not that's not a kind description of what he's trying to do. And it's probably more accurate, again, because he was very antagonistic and he was doing that intentionally. But we don't have to take that approach. You can use it like that too, but you can also do exactly what you've described and lean into that moment of bafflement and enjoy it.
Yeah, leaning into the moment of bafflement. Thoughts on how to prepare, adjust, calibrate the ego such that one might be able to more easily engage with the learning that's on the other side?
Yeah, I think one quite useful way to do that, and I think this is why it works in classrooms to help students to get into that state and lean into that moment, by not doing what Socrates did and pick out the big, heavy, difficult concepts in our world, the love and the justice, but actually pick something that feels a lot more trivial and lighthearted and fun. And so you end up talking about, okay, what is a whole? Or what is a shadow? Or what is a table, right? Just think, you don't have to feel like you've got this big stake and it's not going to define you or your identity or what you believe. It's not going to reveal things about you that you don't want to be revealed. When you get to the point of realizing that actually it's a lot harder to define what a whole is than I thought it was. No one's kind of getting super frustrated and het up about that. And it is a way of experiencing that feeling of aporia, that feeling of bafflement, without a kind of lot of weighty subject matter. And then habituating that, getting into that state more often, learning what to do with it, learning how to be more curious, learning how to sit in it and enjoy it. And then maybe approaching some of the topics that Socrates was more interested in dialogue with people who are similarly disposed, right? Hopefully, at least at first, to reach the end of knowledge on these more weighty topics and still be okay that we don't know for sure how to understand these things.
It was thinking through, how does one set up a practice of getting to the edge of knowledge more often? That maybe with AI, we can say, don't stop asking the hard questions until we get to the ends, right? Or something like that. But because this is not something we could necessarily set up unless we have that unruly uncle that just likes to barrage us or something like that. So thoughts on how to end up in that edge more often?
Yeah, the unruly uncle, but also a child. Children are great at getting us into that state, especially when they're in that stage of the perpetual why. And it's actually a technique that I've seen used in different contexts. I've even heard that it's used in the British Army. It's called the 5 whys. And you just literally ask why 5 times. At a point where you would otherwise stop with the first why, you ask another and another until you've asked at least 5. And that's a very easy way to very quickly get beyond what you're actually comfortable and familiar with knowing. Because, yeah, often you find if you're confronted with a child that does that, it can be quite frustrating, right? Because I don't know. I don't know why. I don't know why the sun shines. I actually don't know. I can tell you the basics of it. But if you ask me 5 times, why is this the case? Then I'm going to quickly get to a point where I don't know. And we can just do that with ourselves, right? You can do that in your day-to-day life. One easy habitual practice is to just notice a why question that pops into your mind every day, once a day. Notice it and then ask 4 more whys, and you'll get into that state quickly.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's an easy practice. And I think of perhaps going out on date nights or something like that, right? You just say, all right, as an exercise, we're gonna do the 5, but just keep asking me why.
Yeah.
On whether it's a ridiculous topic or the more serious, whatever, just to be able to feel in that, to spend more time in that state of unknowing or getting to the point of exasperation.
Yeah.
Like, I'm at the point now, or I'm in the stage of life where I don't have small children around age bracket. So it's very rare that I would actually encounter the 5 whys
Yeah.
or the 20 whys from a toddler. Just being able to engage in that, I think, would be a fun practice to allow us to feel more comfortable when we do get to that point of exasperation.
You speak about a date night. Another good sort of fun exercise to do with a partner or a friend is to, and I do this in workplaces, and it's always fun. Just take a set of concepts, put them in a hat or something like this, and you're pulling them out, and you have to try and draw them, right? And trying to draw, for example, risk or hope or calamity or bafflement, right? And try to draw it. That can be a fun way to recognize, oh, I don't know, how would I represent that as a drawing? And it can quickly push the boundaries and make you think more creatively as well about how you confront that kind of limit of the way you can express and explain concepts without language.
As you were saying those words, like nothing came to mind. I had a pencil hanging over some paper, and I need to draw what that looks like. Wow. So you've chosen to write a book here. Why now?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? Because this is such a universal, age-old kind of topic. And we've already discussed that there's not a huge amount of philosophy out there that explores this. And so that's one good reason to put some out there. But I also do think it's an important moment for this work and for this idea that questions are this everyday form of power that we can all use in our lives and that we can use for positive change. Because, as you said at the start, and the subtitle of my book points towards, we're rushing towards answers. We're living in a world where answers are extremely prevalent. The internet, LLMs are giving us answers, many times more answers than we could possibly process in a lifetime are available absolutely at our fingertips, faster and faster by every day almost at the moment. And we're set up to reach for them. We're set up by our education system, which values and rewards and incentivizes answering rather than asking. And mostly in our professional lives, we're also incentivized to know things, to provide answers, to have them certain, have quick decisions, and not to wait and sit with questions and learn how to sit with confusion and bafflement and ignorance and questions. But there is, I think, a negative effect of that, which is that we are increasingly inclined towards a state that in psychology they call this the need for cognitive closure. So it's which is all about basically trying to grasp for certainty, shut things down, have answers, have solutions. And the higher your need for cognitive closure is, the quicker you're going to be grabbing for those answers and rushing right past the questions. But at the same time, it's the questions that are setting the course to give us the answers. So if we're not paying attention to the questions that we're asking and we're rushing towards the answers, we might well get answers we don't need or want. We won't even notice. We won't spend time to really consider or contemplate whether those are the right things to be asking about. And we'll just end up with increasingly the answers that are being fed into the system. So I think that there's a resistance element to learning to exercise the power of questions. It's a form of genuine power that can change that part of our world and our individual lives, helping us to stop and pause and not need answers quite quickly, giving us a chance, a breath, a pause to just take a look at the questions.
Lots of things we'll unpack there. So let's first go with power. So when you say power, what are the kind of categories that you generally go to first to begin what kinds of power we're talking about?
Yeah, so at a fundamental level, when I think about power, I'm thinking about the capacity to change things. So there's this idea that essentially having power is having this ability to change something. And that can then be applied in lots of different ways. And in the case of questions, it's really almost unlimited how we can apply that power. So that ability to change things can happen. It happens right in the neurochemistry in our brains. When we ask questions, we're already changing the neurochemistry in our brains. We're activating the reward circuit that's connected to the hippocampus. We're releasing dopamine, especially if we're particularly curious about something. There's a kind of dopamine reward signal that happens. And that's a really fascinating form of power change in our brains. And then it goes outside of us to our everyday world. So it changes what we learn. The questions that we ask determine the information that we end up with. That's perhaps particularly important online at the moment, that we're like able to actually exercise the power over what we see and consume online to an extent by paying attention to the questions that we're asking and the way we're interrogating the big stockpile of answers that is the internet. So we can change what we learn, and we can change, therefore, what we know and believe about the world. And then we can extend that to our relationships, and we can have this power to change our relationships, our personal relationships, by asking each other different questions, by asking each other new questions, by not asking questions in certain situations. And we can do that with friends and family and loved ones, partners, but we can also do that with kind of social institutions, doctors, nurses, lawyers, police officers, anyone in a position of authority at work, colleagues. We can change our relationships by changing our questions. So it's all these forms of power and many more.
As you mentioned, the changing in the campus and the changing within our brains, oftentimes as I think about school and the frustration, because if we were to do the 5 whys, if every student was to do that to the teacher, then you're going to run out of school day too quickly. And knowing political power often tries to shut down questions. And so there's more kind of setting up the suppression of questions and how we get that from those in power in whatever capacity. So how does that suppression affect the brain? And then on the flip side, so if we get the suppression, then we now set up a practice, or we at least become aware of it so that we're now taking that suppression away or trying to remove it. Can you talk through that 2 phases and what the promise holds with the relief of that pressure?
Yeah. I think it's really important to look at it in those stages, because if you think about the neurochemistry, right, our brain is set up to reward us for being curious. That's the basic headline of the neuroscience that we have on this. And by the way, we need a lot more neuroscience on this, in my view. We could do loads more research, and I hope we can, and I hope I can be involved at some point in doing a lot more of that research. But as far as we've got to this point, we do understand that there is this common kind of effective curiosity where we're releasing dopamine, the brain's rewarding us for being curious. Why would it do that? It's obvious when you think about the evolutionary background to that mechanism, we are being rewarded for exploring our environment, for looking for new sources of food. So foraging is a kind of early example of how we would be using that type of exploratory mechanism, neurochemically driven mechanism, to explore the environment and find new sources of food. And it's also a way of detecting danger and threat, right? I'm going to pay particular attention to things that look new or different in my environment because they might be a threat. And our brain just wants us to be curious. It wants us to pursue those lines of exploration and inquiry because it's going to keep us fed and it's going to keep us safe. And so it's a very powerful learning mechanism. And then we transport that right into the present day education system. We've got this good understanding that the neurochemistry supports a very powerful and efficient learning mechanism for curiosity. If you're curious about something, you're much more likely to learn the information in the first place and to recall it later. So if that's true, we should go into schools and classrooms and have students being curious and asking their own questions because they are the ones that are meant to be doing the job of learning in that environment. And as you
Right.
say, we find this kind of reverse, this opposite power dynamic where actually it's a lot of the time the teacher asking the vast majority of the questions in the classroom and the students are doing all the answering. And the way we assess and evaluate and go through education incentivizes that. So it has that kind of suppression effect on the brain, right? Because the other fascinating thing about the neurochemistry there is that when you find out the answer to a question that you're curious about, you don't get another dopamine hit. Your brain doesn't actually reward you in the same way for finding something out. It doesn't reward you for getting the food source. It rewards you for looking for it and searching for it and trying to find it, because that's the behavior it wants to encourage. That's the behavior it wants to incentivize and keep going, because that's the one that's going to get you to the next food source and the next one. So you don't get another reward neurochemically for finding out the answer. And so that means that if you're always in the position of being an answerer, you're always in the position of essentially suppressing that really powerful neurochemically driven learning machine that you're naturally set up to. And that up until the point of school, we really use liberally. That's why we have the Y phase. And that typically happens when you're about between 2 and 3. It's usually before school age. And then that kind of drops off a cliff. So there is a kind of suppression. Again, the neurochemistry here is there needs to be more of it, because it would be really good to know exactly what is happening in a child's learning brain when they are being inhibited from asking their own questions. But I can pretty much guarantee that it's not an efficient way of learning. Yeah.
It's fascinating that the dopamine happens while the curiosity is alive and working. And there was just did a podcast episode on the paper. I forget, I'm getting my papers mixed up, but there was some work recently. And the example that the researcher used was talking about this window of curiosity where it's, once you get the answer, the window is closed. So when you're out searching, the window is open and then it closes. I think the name is Curated or something like that. I'm getting it wrong. I'll put it in the show notes. But that idea of, okay, the window is open, the curiosity is flowing. That's when we actually get the dope, other than picking the lottery numbers or whatever. Then you get the win and okay, eureka. But that window of curiosity being open. So I know at the same time, our brain is using far more energy. And I know that we want to close that, right? The brain wants to get to the answer such that it can now shut down that operation and move on to the next one. So there's a little bit of competing priorities. It's like, okay, there's going to be a cost to you having this curiosity about whatever it doesn't, like mental energy. You're going to get exhausted. You're going to be tired. Your brain is driving towards getting that open loop closed. But that's one process. I guess that how I can look at it is in a car, okay, that's the engine running or whatever, but the air conditioning is a different system. and the dopamine that comes from the open loop of curiosity, that there's a lot of benefit that comes from that. So as long as you're aware of it, you can embrace the energy expenditure associated with trying to keep that window open and get after the curiosity, because you're going to learn, you're going to get more dopamine and the like. Am I putting pieces together? Does that sound right?
Yeah, that does sound right. And yeah, I think the kind of effect of the engine is the right metaphor there, I think, because it really is like it is driving this learning. And like an engine, if you keep it running, right, it is going to ultimately deplete to some extent. But the thing that's interesting is that, again, we go back to that idea of need for cognitive closure. And that's what you're describing when we're talking about that need to shut down that system at some point to give it a break. And what's interesting about that is that need for cognitive closure seems to rise when we're stressed. So if you're generally stressed, not like just in an immediate threat situation, but a general stress level. So this has been looked at, for example, in the context of the pandemic. It's also been looked at in the aftermath of terrorist events. That high level of stress raises this need for cognitive closure to shut down the loop. And so when we reduce that stress level, we're better able to keep the engine running. We're less cognitively and neurologically disposed to shutting it down. And that's, I think, quite important, going back to the question of why now, because this is a stressful world we're living in right now. And that suggests that the need for cognitive closure is higher, maybe across the board, right? Financial insecurity, economic insecurity, political, social insecurities that are raising the levels of stress and probably, therefore, the level of need for cognitive closure. And that's a kind of shutting the engine down mechanism. But what it's correlated with is a bunch of kind of psychological phenomenon that essentially reward a kind of form of tribalism. Like you're much more likely, if you're in that heightened state of need for cognitive closure, you're much more likely to favor your in-group, people that you perceive to look like you and be like you and identify like you, and to be afraid or more threatened by the out-group or perceived others. It's also correlated with the endorsement of autocratic leadership. That's a quote from these researchers that have done that work. We're finding that there are these tendencies ebbing through the social, political world that we're currently living in. They're correlated with this rise in stress, which is correlated with the need for cognitive closure. If we can resist that by keeping the engine running a little bit longer, then we can maybe lower some of those tendencies in our own psychological profile.
The cognitive closure and the need for that's fascinating. That because I'm assuming that it gets tied back to threat levels, because if I don't know what the threat is, if the tiger is going to get me, I'm going to close down my curiosity level because this is the threat that I'm most concerned about. So I'm going to be less open to creative solutions, other questions, and the like. This curiosity doesn't have a chance. I guess that would be a way to say, on the fly here, making this up. So then the priority of things is threat, what's going to eat me, what's going to kill me. And then a higher level is the curiosity to understand and to be able to ask questions. So this immediate threat, this lower level threat in the hierarchy, if you will, then that's where I'm going to put the resources to. That's where I'm going to shield the incoming ideas of maybe my neighbor is not my enemy because they look differently or believe differently than me, and driving back to that tribalism.
Yeah.
And
I think that's right. But the curious part about it is that our curiosity is also a mechanism that's helping to protect us from threat and danger. At what point our kind of brain decides that it's going to shut down the engine when actually we really need it to be running. to get away from the tiger, right?
Because now in that scenario, if the window of curiosity is open, and if that's where we get our dopamine from, the feel good stuff, by virtue of shutting or keeping that closed more, we're not getting the dopamine of curiosity about the people around us, about the things that interest us. And so it's a downward spiral because now I'm not getting that good stuff or the feel good, if you will. And it's driving me down in a downward spiral because it's protect, protect.
Yeah.
And nothing there is going to give us the good feel because it's just more going in the same direction.
And what the good feel is facilitating is the learning mechanism, so that I'm going to take on the information I actually need to assess and evaluate this threat. And the more you go down that loop, you're shutting off that capacity to take on that information and retain it and encode it properly. And you're getting less and less of the information that you need into your system. And yeah, that's going to have a kind of compounding effect.
So how do you think that works with bias? Right? Because we're going to be wanting to go, most of them want to default to our biases because it's cognitively easier. And the easy one right now is politically. So if I stay within my tribe, I shut down because I want to protect, and I believe that my tribe is going to protect me. I believe that's where safety is. And I'm not going to experience the dopamine of goodness. But if I get on Facebook where a bunch of my tribe is out there ranting and railing against the opposition, I think I'm getting a dopamine hit somewhere because it's just so attractive to get stuck into that tribal loop. But what are your thoughts on, is that the case? Is that you think that it's dopamine that we're actually getting after or seeking in those moments? And then thoughts on ways to break through that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, dopamine is seemingly endlessly complicated how we get these reward circuits going. And there are so many of, I think there's about, at least in the literature I've trawled through, 24 or 25 different regions of the brain that are associated with this release of dopamine in the case of curiosity. It's so complicated. And of course, we're getting it in different ways from different sources, from different stimuli, and they're serving us in different ways. But yeah, I do think there's a kind of relationship between this process of shutting down or closing off certain learning mechanisms, curiosity-driven learning mechanisms that facilitate and compound biases, because we're just not getting extra information and we're not getting opposing information. We're not getting different perspectives into the system, into our Facebook feeds or our social groups or our dinner party conversation, whatever it is. And curiosity, again, is this powerful tool. Questions are this extremely powerful way to break out of that and to actively seek different views and different perspectives. And one of the things I talk about in the book, and it's a central aim of the book, is to help readers to identify in themselves what I call a questioning mindset, and then develop and refine that mindset. And one of the reasons that I think that's an powerful and empowering thing to do is because a questioning mindset comes with kind of this like goodie bag of brilliant traits that we want, especially if we're going to be good thinkers. And those are curiosity, but also open-mindedness and humility. And all three of those come in a kind of goodie bag when you're developing a questioning mindset, because if you're engaging in questions, you're pursuing a curiosity, perhaps, especially if you're intentionally choosing to be curious. And then you're necessarily open. You're open-minded when you're asking questions sincerely from a place of good faith, from a place of curiosity, because you haven't already got the answer. You're open to considering that there might be more than one way things are. Even a simple yes-no question gives you that. It gives you this binary. It's either yes or no. And right now, my brain, and I'm imagining that it could be one or the other of those. And that's giving me this kind of free open-mindedness that comes from simply asking a yes-no question. And then you've got
Mm.
humility that goes with that as well, because underlying that is an admission to yourself or to someone else that you don't know something, that you're seeking to know something that you don't know. And that's a kind of what I would call an intellectual humility. We call that in the area of philosophy that I've been in for a while. It's called virtue epistemology. Intellectual virtues are kind of a key idea, and one of those would be intellectual humility. So the kind of admission and acceptance that you don't know something. And that, again, that comes in this goodie bag with questioning. So yeah, all of those things we need: humility, curiosity, open-mindedness, to break out of biases and prejudices and do it in a way that's non-threatening to ourselves and to others. And we do that by, I think, by becoming great questioners and empowering ourselves with the questioning mindset that we all have and we can all develop and learn to use in really powerful ways.
What are your thoughts about where we are at as far as a society in the world of critical thinking? And we can get to the AI piece, but let's even just say kind of pre-AI stuff, and then we can talk AI on its own.
Yeah, I guess a lot of my work early on in my studies was focused on education and looking at kind of dynamics of learning and teaching, and the dynamics of question and answer between learners and teachers. And one thing that became very clear to me was that there are a bunch of traits of thinking and learning that can help us to do it better, and that are not always being actively taught in classrooms. So these are things like curiosity, open-mindedness, and intellectual humility. And I think you do start there, when at least I start there, when I think about how do we turn out adults as thinkers, right? We will go through an education system. It's not everything. It's not everything about how we learn to think. And there are lots of forces at play that are affecting how we think as adults, independently of how we're educated. But our education is shaping a lot of the ways that we go into the adult world and approach the challenges that you face. If we're not teaching open-mindedness, if we're not teaching humility, if we're not teaching curiosity, we can't really expect to be developing adults that are particularly good at displaying those qualities. I don't think that's an overly simplistic version of things, because obviously the world is full of very open-minded and curious and intellectually humble people, but it could probably be more full of them. There could probably be more of those people, and each of us could probably develop those traits more in our own lives and in our own thinking. And I would start with education and go straight into the workplace and see, how do you cultivate those types of thinking traits in the workplace? Again, it comes back to me to learning how to ask great questions.
What do you think goes into a great question, or asking better questions?
So I have a kind of 3-part theory. It's not complicated, it's pretty simple, but it's just a kind of way of carving up the terrain of good questioning. So I think of it as there's a content component, a content element, by which I mean there's a what. What are you asking? What are you trying to find out? And if we pay attention to what we're asking and what we're trying to find out, we've done a huge amount of work towards asking a good question. But you haven't gone all the way, because you've got to also consider your context, the context component. And that's, who am I asking? When am I asking them? Where am I asking them? What's my kind of questioning context? What's the context for this question? I know what I want to find out, but if I ask the wrong person, or I ask at the wrong time, they're super busy, they don't want to give me the answer, or I ask in the wrong place, then I might not get the information. I might not get the answer. I might not have that power that I would otherwise have. And then you also have a communication component, which is how. It might be that I know exactly what I want to ask, and I've got exactly the right context. I've found the right person. Got the right time and the right place, but I've fumbled my question in some way. I've asked it in a particularly convoluted way, or I've asked it the wrong language, or I've whispered it. There are lots of ways that we could communicate badly. And so I think, in a way, it's useful for me to break down that process of good questioning into this what, when, where, who, how, and then there is an underlying why. that allows us to look in a little bit more fine-grained detail at that process of asking questions and go, okay, actually, I could have gone wrong here in a couple of different ways. And if I think a bit more closely about, okay, I did know what I wanted to ask, but I probably misjudged the person who I looked at, or I asked an AI, I asked an LLM, and I should have asked my granddad. And that's the kind of way of, just breaking it down and thinking about it a little bit more detail.
As you mentioned the granddad, and what came to mind is just letting the curiosity go on nuance. Because as I think about the comparison between asking an LLM or granddad about life and pick a date or some kind of an experience, the LLM or the AI it will give an answer. But then talking with granddad, it's like the way he's going to say it is probably going to open up some opportunities for burrowing into the nuance. And why he said it that way, or the word choice specifically, that just an AI is not going to give, or you're not going to come on the same kind of little subtleties.
And there's a couple of things the granddad's going to do that the LLM isn't. And the granddad's not going to say at the end of his answer to your question, maybe you want to also ask this question, right? He's not going to lead you down a path of curiosity. He's not going to say, did you also want to know about my experiences in this part of the world at this time? AI is going to increasingly do that, right? It's going to lead us down a path of kind of the most common route that you could take through this line of inquiry that you're pursuing. And you're not going to get that typically when you have a conversation with granddad or whoever, any other human person. And the other thing you're not going to get when you ask an LLM versus a human is a feeling of trust between you and another human being. Because when you ask another human being a question, you ask granddad about his experiences when he was growing up, you not only get all that nuance and beautiful kind of extra detail that you get from a human, but you also going to form a connection. You're going to build a little bit more into your relationship with that person, assuming that your granddad isn't going to blatantly lie to you. Then you've got this level of trust that you can start, okay, when I ask granddad questions, he tells me honest answers. And that's giving me this kind of foundation of trust and belief in him and in our relationship. And it's a kind of human form of social bonding that I think we are really seriously overlooking when we just turn to machines to ask questions all the time. And I can talk endlessly about why I think that's a problem, but that's an important distinction between asking a human and asking an AI, that you just end up without that forming that social trust and that social bond that you would otherwise have had.
Can you touch a little bit on some of those concerns that you have for going down this path, or exclusively going down this path?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. That it goes back to this kind of evolutionary story, really. Why did we become questioners in the first place? What kind of is the point of being a questioning species? And we've looked at a number of reasons that we have become a questioning. It's helping us to learn. It's helping us to gather information about our environment, avoid dangers. And those are clearly things that would have been very beneficial to our survival. But when we start living in more complex, larger social groups, as we at one point did in the history of the human species, we had to do something extra. We had to start sharing information between groups and communities, because otherwise we would be wasting a huge amount of time and resource and energy all going out and looking for the same berry hoard in the bushes, when actually that guy over there already found the berries and he can tell me where they are, but I just need to ask him. And if I don't ask him, I'm just going to waste my time looking for the same berry hoard. So we developed this ability to basically get information from each other and distribute it around a community. And what that does is it then cements this form of trust between the members of the community. I can trust that if I ask you where those berries are, you're going to actually tell me the answer and it's going to be true and reliable and honest. Now, obviously, it's not always the case. Like we don't always give honest answers. Sometimes we just don't admit what we don't know, or we deliberately distort and misinform. But it seems implausible to me that's the norm, because otherwise we wouldn't have bothered developing a system of questioning each other for information. It would have been completely pointless to ask someone for information if you had no reason to believe that they were going to give you that information in a truthful way. So it does cement that trust underlying a kind of social relationships that we need in order to communicate and cooperate, coordinate our actions in social groups. And of course, now we're living in wildly more complicated and complex and crazy level of complexity, the social groups and social situations that we're now living in. And we're diminishing that capacity to ask each other questions and cement and keep building that form of social trust between ourselves, because we're increasingly turning, and I am absolutely doing this myself, it's really hard not to, turning to technology for answers because they're so quick and easy. But we are missing that opportunity when we don't ask each other questions to learn to trust each other properly.
It mentioned in something I'd written about recently, that idea of before you ask the LLM or before you hit enter on the LLM, try to answer the question yourself. Or it's like just these micro moments of how can I either push back a little bit or exercise that muscle, if you will. What are ways that I can do that? Or if I'm going to ask somebody a question, then if they have the moment anyway, try to think on what that answer might be, or to what are creative ways that you can still exercise this muscle and still perhaps engage with technology or people anyway. But yeah, just not give up all the way. The temptation. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And it can be small, right? It doesn't have to be wholesale, throw your smartphone in the sea, but you can resist the urge to enter it quite as often. And of course, there's lots of reasons that we might want to do that. And this is just one of them. I do think it's an important one. That moment in which you're saying, can I answer this question myself? Another thing you can do is say, is there someone else I could ask? That's the who component of the great questioning. And it might be that you've got a great question and you know exactly what to ask, you know exactly how to ask it, but taking a moment to go, maybe I could just walk into the kitchen and ask my partner this instead of asking an LLM. And even if they don't have the answer, we might have a conversation that we wouldn't have otherwise had. Or even, I think, even at the bus stop, right? Or at the train station, or go and ask someone standing on the platform when the next train is due, instead of just relying on your phone to find out that information. It seems like, why would I do that? It's right there in my hand. And then we have to really focus on the answer to that question being, because this form of social connection, this form of relationship building that can be very everyday and very simple, is actually also very important.
So I had a very odd experience the other day. I was coming out of a pet shop and a woman asked me for directions. I was like, first I had stepped out. She was walking up the sidewalk. She paused. She looked at me and I was like, okay, this kind of thing just doesn't happen anymore. And then she asked me for directions to a local road. And what flickered through my head was, why in the world is she asking me? Because everyone has a smartphone. So there was just this weird moment of unfamiliarity, which 15 years ago, 20 years ago, that was how we got around.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. I now no longer ask anyone how to get anywhere. It's just tell me what the address is, because I'll plug it in and off I go. But it caused me to think through, what is the best way? So she's not from here. It may not be the most direct route, but what is the simplest to communicate that she's going to be able to remember? And so I told her, I said, take a left at that stop sign. So it was like, okay, very practical there, go through the traffic circle and take a left at your first light. So now it's stop sign, through a circle, and a left at the light. I could have said, and you're going to pass through 3 different stop signs along. But that was irrelevant information. It's first stop sign, go through a circle, and then the first light. But there was actually a moment of connection there. And that moment has stuck with me because it was, well, I get a chance to be helpful. So that's lovely. And I can't even explain all the ways that it's resonated. But that question is eons old.
Yeah.
About how do I get there? How do I get over that ridge? Is there a way? Where's...
Yeah.
And we just don't completely miss out on that now.
Exactly. And exactly. It goes all the way back right through the most deepest evolutionary history we can think of. We're finding ways to help each other coordinate our actions in the world, and asking how to get somewhere from someone who might have information that you don't have is like one of the most fundamental ways that we just coordinate our actions and form that trust. Because particularly important that if you clearly did a really good job there, because I find it really difficult to give directions because I've been relying on the technology that tells me how to get somewhere for far too long. And so to give someone directions in the street, it's quite nerve-wracking to me. I also don't know my left and right, so that doesn't help. But there's an interesting kind of coupling of de-skilling there, right? Because we think, oh, the de-skilling has happened because the de-skilling has happened in our capacity to give directions because we've got it on our phone and we don't know the routes in our head anymore. But the de-skilling is doubled because you're not being asked. We're not asking each other. And that's a huge reason why you then don't have the opportunity to practice that skill of giving someone direction. And it's like you say, it's this fundamental connectivity that we just don't experience anymore. That used to be one of the examples I would go to all the time 15 years ago when I was thinking about this kind of as a PhD student. Yeah, think about when you ask directions in the street. It would be one of the examples I would just pull out the pocket to explain why questions are important, and we use them in this daily way. And it's a crazy example now because nobody does it.
What world are you from? We don't do that around in these parts.
Yeah. Another one is do you have the time? Sometimes you hear someone ask that, and how could you possibly not know the time? Surely you have access to the time. But that used to be a question that you would hear. Oh, that would be a common question you'd ask someone.
So I think that would be fun exercise to do, is to think about what are these ancient questions that were the everyday questions, like directions, like where is a good food place? And it doesn't have to be the best ever. Just what is a local recommendation that you like? What is someplace around here that you like? And like directions, because time, it would be a more modern question than directions.
Yeah.
But then, so to think on what are some of these ancient questions and just go ask them on a more regular basis. Doesn't have to be one a day or whatever, right? But figure out some way, it's just a regular practice to ask these ancient questions. Because I do think about this more often now of what are we wired to do and how do I exercise that? Exactly to these ancient kind of things of questions and curiosity and such. What are the things that this body is designed to do, the brain is designed to do, and how can I do some of those things that an ancestor 15,000 years ago or 100,000 years ago would have done? So like a recent thing, because I saw a clip of kids in like a daycare and they were playing bird songs and the kids were sleeping, and the video clip gave credit to the bird songs for these kids sleeping. Now, I have no idea whether that's the case or not, but I've taken to on the Calm app, I've chosen the one soundtrack that includes bird songs. And for the last couple of months or whatever, that's the one that I play, because the idea is now, not that birds would be singing at night. So we'll set that aside for a moment, but it's like the bird songs tell my nervous system, just evolutionary wise, that it's safe.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, okay, I wonder what other things like that exist where I can tap into the long history that, like the idea of staring into flames from a campfire, right? The campfire was the place that everything wound down, and a lot of studies on that. So it's how often can I just stare or look at the flames just to tap into the deep evolutionary history of who we are?
Yeah. And there's a kind of seeking novelty. We've been talking about that. That is such a deep evolutionarily driven impulse that we can dial up in ourselves through questioning and intentionally seeking new things. One of the kind of curiosity habits or practices that I like as a kind of very everyday thing to do is just take a route that you know, or look out of a view, look out of a window that you know very well, or even just look in a room that you know and try to find something new in the view or in the journey or in the experience. How many new things you can spot and intentionally pay attention to. And it's a really simple way to not only make something that might otherwise feel mundane and familiar seem but interesting again, but to do exactly what you're describing, to lean into that mechanism that we actually are wired for, which we do, right? That's the job of a baby. My daughter is 17 months now, and she's absolutely wired to look at anything that's different or new. If I jump up and down in a funny way, she's really going to pay attention to that because it's new and it's different and it's going to be entertaining and funny to her. You can be the funniest person on earth, right? To a toddler who's just wired to see anything new and grab onto it and gravitate towards it and process it. And we naturally develop out of that intense novelty seeking that you have as a child, right? Because we become more familiar with the things and the objects and we know how to name them and place them. But at the same time, it's undeniable that even in the most everyday, mundane day of your life, there are countless new and novel things that you'll experience that if you just pay attention to them, you'll reawaken that kind of drive that is very ancient and important for us.
Now, you mentioned that inquisitiveness is a virtue. And so how do you see that kind of a virtue of questioning as different from just plain curiosity?
Yeah. So again, we're in this territory of virtue epistemology that is an area of philosophy that I am familiar with. And we're talking about intellectual virtues, so basically qualities of good thinking. By the way, I forgot to mention earlier that there's a fantastic place in Long Beach in California called the Intellectual Virtues Academy. And a friend and colleague of mine, Jason Bear, who is a leading light in this field, and he's been very involved in setting up this place called the Intellectual Virtues Academy, where they have this particular focus. It's a middle school on helping the students to develop these types of intellectual virtues like curiosity and open-mindedness and humility and inquisitiveness. I wanted to mention that because, yeah, it's an antidote in a way to what we were describing earlier. And it's a very successful school. But yeah, so inquisitiveness in that context for me is about not just asking lots of questions. It's about going back to look at the good ones, asking good questions, because there's a sense in which we can just ask any number of questions at anyone in any way we like. That is within our gift as human beings. But in order to turn it into a virtue and turn it into something that's truly useful for thinking and learning and connecting and engaging, we need to pay attention to doing it well. So inquisitiveness as a virtue is the characteristic kind of motivation to engage in good questioning.
So to get to the good questions, because we talked a little bit about it, how do you think about getting to those and when almost kind of the practical side of things on, so for you, do you sit down and write out and kind of brainstorm questions and interrogate those questions to try to get to questions? Is that part of the practice of asking?
Yeah, I think it can be. I certainly think it can be. There's a great technique which is called question storming, exactly what you described. It's brainstorming, but for questions. The version of that technique that I use and have taught and use it myself in my own life comes from another great organization called the Right Question Institute, based in Boston, and they teach
Yeah.
lots of teachers, right, to teach students to ask good questions, and they use the technique that they've developed, the question formulation technique. And the first part of that technique is this question storming process, which essentially involves, brainstorming with questions, right? Set a timer, give yourself 2 minutes, give yourself 5 minutes. Sometimes I give myself 15 minutes, right? And the primary goal of that exercise is to try and ask as many questions as possible in that space of time. And I find that very useful in a number of different scenarios. It can be very useful for generative, creative thinking, breaking out of a kind of common line of thinking for yourself and challenging yourself to come up with new questions. And it's like a natural process because you're incentivized to just keep asking questions, And by the end of that 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes, you've ended up asking questions that you definitely would not have got to if you hadn't gone through that process. But it can also be a very like sort of practical skill to use if you're facing something particularly important or significant where you're going to be asking questions at a medical appointment or a conversation with a colleague at work, a meeting. You might want to take a little moment to literally 3 minutes to generate a few questions before going into that scenario. That might help and it certainly does help me to come up with some questions I wouldn't otherwise have come up with. And more importantly, pay attention to the types of questions I'm going to go into that situation asking. There's one thing I will say about that is that a lot of the time we're asking questions, we don't have 2 or 3 minutes to sit down and do a question storming process beforehand. And I still think we can absolutely turn on and dial up the skill of good questioning in those situations and a huge part of that is just simply paying attention. It's the easiest thing in the world you can do, right? Just start noticing your questions. And once you start noticing how they're having an effect, the questions you're asking are determining what you come to find out, how you relate to other people, what you come to learn about them, or how you relate to them or how they perceive you, all of these different effects that we're talking about that good questions have or questions have. And once you really start noticing that, you can actually become engaged in asking better ones because you can see they're doing work in your life.
Yes, because I absolutely look at this whole world of questioning as a skill. It can be improved and it's important. I think that it's a skill worth improving. So just like any other skill, paying attention to it. If you shoot archery, then you're paying attention to your breath. You're evaluating how I did at the end of the session, and you're putting thought and time, effort into it to go, okay, yes, this is how I'm doing. If I was to take that same kind of idea if I applied that to questions, then I might record or review back the Zoom call to say, okay, or put the transcript into an algorithm and say, what were the questions that I asked, right? And now how can I get better at these, right? So if it is a skill and we take it seriously as a skill, then how are we applying those things of any other skill to this to be able to get better? Otherwise, we don't know if we're getting any better or not.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that skill framing is really important because of exactly what you're pointing towards. It's important to recognize this is something you can learn to do and do better in your own life. And the idea that it's a skill is integral to recognizing that.
So we're probably going to start towards wrapping up conversation because this has been lovely, and I look forward to continuing the conversation in whatever capacity. So what elements of questions have we not touched on that, whether it's from the book or just our conversation, that needs a little bit more exploration, you think?
I think probably in a way we've talked about all the amazing, empowering effects of great questioning. There is a darker side that's maybe worth drawing attention to some extent, a kind of way that if this is indeed a power and an ability to change things, there's no guarantee that it's going to be used well or used to change things in a positive way. And so it's important. And again, it goes back to that paying attention point that once we start paying attention, we're not only seeing how questions are having an effect for us in our own lives as a form of power that we can use, but having an effect on us by the questions that we're being asked and exposed to by others that,
Yeah.
often I think unintentionally are misusing and abusing the power of questions for change that isn't in our interests. So I think that's probably important to draw attention to.
Yes. As you were saying that, I think that there's room, or at least at this point, at some point, I'm going to do a podcast episode specifically on kind of the dark side of questions, because I keep talking about the positives of it. But to your point, it's as a tool, as a warning to be able to have that conversation, understand it, and then tools to get yourself out of the circumstance. And I think of just historically how, and this is tied back to theology, how scripture might be used as a cudgel. And then it's like, and I'm thinking a lot of circumstances where women are put down and the like of, you don't want to disobey God, do you? So therefore, I am the head of the household, so therefore you will go and do this kind of harm. And so an investigation to acknowledge it, and then to be able to understand it, maybe some countermeasures and the like, to be able to find your way out of some of those difficult circumstances.
Yeah. It's important to, it's really important to recognize that anywhere there is a form of power, it can be abused. And even with the best possible intentions, that can be the case. And I do think we see that in the case of questions. In the book, I approach this in the context of law and the way that lawyers are trained to ask questions, which can, of course, and absolutely does serve justice in many situations, but also absolutely does get abused and misused in courtrooms as a form of power. And the reason why courtrooms are such a good context for exposing that is because they have what I call throughout the book this lopsided question answer dynamic that we in classrooms, where it's teachers asking questions and students answering them. They're in relationships where one person does all the questioning and the other person does all the answering. Say they're in podcast interviews where one person does a lot of the questioning, another does a lot of the answering, and those power dynamics are useful and important, but sometimes they're very disruptive. And in a courtroom, they're extremely explicit and extreme. It's almost not a lopsided dynamic. It's a one-sided dynamic because you're legally constrained if you're in a witness stand or a jury from asking questions. And the power of questions is all in the hands of the lawyer, the barrister in the courtroom. And that compounds an existing form of power in the courtroom, allowing the barrister to direct attention to certain things, away from other things, direct the course of conversation, direct the answers. The famous kind of maxim that in a courtroom you shouldn't ever ask a question you don't already know the answer to. It's kind of the opposite of curiosity. We don't want an enormous amount of curiosity in courtroom, but there's a kind of extreme end of that where you're manipulating and controlling the narrative of what someone else says and reveals and what they aren't able or don't have the opportunity to say or reveal, and that can drastically influence the course of a trial. And there's really good research on how even very subtle effects of even the order of a question, a line of questioning, or particular words that are picked out in a particular question can affect the answer and affect the witness testimony and therefore affect the jury, and that can lead to mistrial of justice for sure. Anyway, it's a very stark example of the misuse of power as a result of being in control of the questioning. And that's an explicit case, but we have it in everyday life all the time.
As a recent jury foreman in a trial, I absolutely saw that, and I was paying in particular attention to the questions and how, what was asked, what wasn't asked. And I came back in the jury room and having conversations with my fellow jurors. I really wanted to flesh out one of the questions that one of the jurors really had to hang up on. And we didn't have it clear in the jury room. We spent time refining the question and sending it back to the judge. And I love it. The judge's response was, the jury has all the information it needs.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm like, that if you're a parent and want to shut down conversation or whatever, that is the model, or that is a model. But yeah, getting to see that live and really live through it. And there were some absolute questions that we had, and it was like, why wasn't this even brought up?
Yeah. And you are completely disempowered, completely disempowered because you are unable to ask questions. Yeah.
Yeah, it was an amazing time. But grateful for the opportunity, right? It's civic duty, and we get to use questions or observations and all of it. We get to practice this apart from the actual asking of questions, but we get to see it unfold as all in various elements.
Yeah.
One of my last questions that I ask guests is, what is your right now question? So this is somewhere between what's for dinner and who am I going to get married, if I'm going to get married, and those bigger questions. And it comes back to the questions that you're carrying with you right now. So with that broad definition, what are your right now questions or question?
Without being needlessly promotional, but it is true, right? The book is on the question, and it's coming out on the 4th in the US, the 27th in the UK. And I guess my right now questions are very taken up with who is it going to reach, and who's going to read it, and who's going to engage and find it useful and valuable in their own lives, and how are they going to take the ideas forward and implement them in their own lives. And those are the questions that are occupying my mind right now when I think about the book actually going out into the world and landing on people's bookshelves and coffee tables. And yeah.
Exciting time. Really is. Yeah. Now, we didn't touch on this previously, and we even covered the fact that there's not a massive amount of literature out there. With that said, what kind of is the target? Or what is the niche you think that you're really getting after with this work?
It's one of the funny things, isn't it, about this topic, is that in a way, I'm very grateful for my agent and my editor for taking a risk on this topic in this book, because one of the constant questions around it is, who is this for? And the reason that's such a salient and big picture question all the time is because it's for everyone, right? It's like, do you ask questions? Yes. And then if you do, you're someone that can potentially benefit from asking them better and taking that power in your life. And then you might be interested in thinking about that more through this book and this research. In a way, the answer that I always want to give is just anyone who asks questions is my target audience for this book. And that can be frustrating for marketers and salespeople and promotional people. And where are we going to put that on the bookshelf, people? But that's the honest answer.
you know, in time, hopefully that bookshelf expands or that section.
Right.
So you walk into the bookshelf and there's eventually a label that says books about questions instead of just business and the other big categories. But
Exactly.
yeah, yeah. Lovely. So thank you for the time. Thank you for the work that you've put in all these years getting to this point, and then also taking the time and the blood, sweat, and tears that go into actually generating a book. And I'm looking forward to celebrating the release of it and getting a chance to do my little piece to promote the questions and the conversation about it. Excited about that. Where is the best place for folks to catch up with you? And I know we had us previously talked, you've also got a course up and coming. So you kind of give some of that detail.
Yeah, no. So I think you mentioned I'm the questions doctor online. All my social media is under that handle. But you can also visit my website, philosophyofquestions.com. That's been running for a long time. That's got some interesting stuff on there, some interesting research that you can take part in. There's a survey about what is a question on there, which I've got a lot of responses to in the past. And I keep gathering that data and it keeps getting more and more interesting. If you want to feel kind of aporia, if you want to get into that state of bafflement, then take that survey. There's also a tool that I developed with a colleague, Ian Robson, called the Questioning Strengths Assessment. And that's a psychometric test that looks at your questioning strengths and how you ask questions and what type of questioner you are. And the online course should be coming out probably in September. It's called How to Build a Questioning Mindset, but it relies on this idea of questioning strengths, identifying your strengths and how you can develop them and use them in different areas of your life. And you'll be able to find that links to all of these things and my academic work and so on the website and through social media.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. All right. Thank you for coming on and being a part of the Curated Questions community. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Ken. And thank you, of course, for your question.
Absolutely. That's what we do in these parts. Yes. Thank you.